When they prepared Louis Armstrong's body in the summer of 1971, the undertaker in Corona, Queens, found something the whole watching world had somehow missed for 70 years. Around the neck of the most famous Baptist trumpet player who ever lived, worn smooth, tucked under the collar, resting against the skin over his heart, hung a small, silver Star of David. He had worn it without a single day's exception since before most people alive had ever heard his name. New Orleans. A freezing Monday morning in the winter of 1907. 5:30, still dark, the gas lamps hissing over the mud streets of a neighborhood the police called the battlefield. A boy of 7 years old climbed up onto a rickety junk wagon beside a man who was not his father and blew warm air into his own hands. That boy owned nothing. No horn, no shoes without holes, no father who stayed. What the family on that wagon would do for him over the next few years is the reason a Baptist from the poorest block in America was buried wearing the star of a faith that was not his own. He never once told most people why, but he never took it off. You have to understand the corner of the world little Louis was born into. They called it the battlefield for a reason. It was the back of Storyville, the roughest few blocks in New Orleans, where the cribs and the honky-tonks spilled their noise into the street all night and the gutters ran with things a child shouldn't see. His mother, Mary Ann, was barely more than a girl herself. His father had walked out before Louis could remember his face. He was 7 years old, and he was already working. Not playing at working, working. He hauled coal. He sold newspapers in the dark before school he mostly didn't attend. He scavenged the docks. And a couple of mornings a week, he rode with the Karnofskys. The Karnofskys were a Jewish family, immigrants out of Lithuania, who had come to America with nothing and built a small living hauling coal and rags and junk through the poor streets on a mule-drawn wagon. They were not rich. They were barely a rung above the black families they rode past. But in a city that had a law and a slur for every kind of person, the Karnofskys looked at a barefoot colored boy standing on their corner in the cold and saw, simply, a child who needed work and a meal. They gave him both. "You ride with us today, little Louis," Morris Karnofsky, one of the sons, would call out. "Papa says come." And little Louis came. He would tell the story himself near the end of his life, in shaky handwriting on hotel stationery, how the Karnofsky family took a hungry black child to their table and fed him, how they never once made him feel like charity. How, on the wagon, riding the dark streets before dawn, old Mrs. Karnofsky would rock her own baby to sleep and sing to it, a soft Russian lullaby in a language Louis didn't know one word of. He never forgot the sound of it. 70 years later, he could still hum the tune. There was a rhythm to the work. To draw customers out of their houses, junk men blew little tin horns as the wagon rolled. Louis begged to try. They handed him a battered 10-cent tin horn, and the boy who had nothing pressed it to his lips and blew. And something happened on that wagon that neither he nor the Karnofskys understood the size of yet. People came out of their doors, not for the junk, for the sound. Louis learned he could bend the note, curl it, make the tin horn do things it had no business doing. Mr. Karnofsky watched the boy in the mirror of his own two eyes and said the words that would change the history of American music. "That boy," he told his sons, "has music in him, real music. He should have a real horn." A real horn. Louis had never in his life dared to want a thing so large. There was a pawn shop Louis passed on his rounds. In the window, behind dusty glass, sat a used cornet, tarnished, dented on the bell. Somebody's pawned dream waiting on a shelf. $5. $5 in 1907 to a coal-hauling 7-year-old was the moon. It was 100 meals. It was more cash than passed through his small hands in a month of dark mornings. He would stop at that window and stand and look and say nothing. And then he would go back to the wagon and blow the tin horn and pretend the cornet in the glass was not slowly breaking his heart. He counted it out once in his head, the way children count impossible things. If he saved every penny he earned and spent nothing, not on food, not on anything, it would take him the better part of a year. And a boy that hungry could not save a penny. He knew it. He stopped doing the arithmetic because the arithmetic only ever ended one way. So he wanted it in silence. That was the safest way a poor child knew how to want. But the Karnofskys saw him at that window. They always saw him. "How much? The horn?" Mr. Karnofsky asked one afternoon, in his heavy accent, nodding at the pawn-shop glass. Louis looked at his feet. $5, sir. It's all right. I don't need it." "Everybody needs something," the old man said. "The question is only whether they will let somebody help them get it." Louis didn't answer. He had never in his life had an answer to a sentence like that. Here is the part that matters. The part Louis would carry to his grave, quite literally, against his chest. The Karnofskys did not have $5 to spare. This was not a rich man dropping loose coins on a whim. This was a family that counted every cent, that had crossed an ocean with less than nothing, that knew exactly what a dollar was, because they had bled for each one. They had their own children to feed. They owed nobody a thing, least of all a boy who wasn't theirs, of a color the whole city told them to keep at arm's length. They helped him anyway. They advanced him the money, most of it out of their own thin pocket, the rest against the small wages Louis earned on the wagon. Not a gift dropped from above to make themselves feel generous. Something better. They treated a 7-year-old's dream as a debt worth backing. They bet real money, money they needed, on a barefoot child nobody else in New Orleans would have wagered a nickel on. "You pay it back with work," Mr. Karnofsky told him. "A little each week. A man should carry his own horn." A man. The old junk dealer had called him a man. Louis walked into that pawn shop with the money clutched so tight his knuckles went pale. He walked out holding the dented cornet like it was made of glass and fire. He cleaned it that night with rags and spit and the tail of his own shirt. He worked the stuck valves until they moved. And then, in the dark of the poorest block in America, a 7-year-old boy raised a $5 pawn shop cornet to his mouth and blew his first real note. It cracked. Of course it cracked. First notes always do. He blew it again and again. His mother heard it through the thin wall and told him to hush. It was late. He waited until her breathing went slow, and then he blew it once more, softer, into the crook of his own arm. And by the third try, the sound that came out was not a boy playing at a horn. It was the very first breath of a voice the entire 20th century would eventually stop to listen to. Kings would hear that voice. Presidents. 18,000 people at a time would weep at the sound of it. It would knock the Beatles off the top of the charts. It would travel to Africa and Europe and the far side of the earth as the sound of America itself.
And it started on a junk wagon with a tin horn, because a poor immigrant family looked at a poor black child and decided he was worth $5 they didn't have. Lewis paid every cent of it back, a little each week off the wagon wages, exactly the way the old man had said. He was proud of that his whole life, that they hadn't given him the horn. They had believed in him enough to let him earn it. He never forgot which of those two things a child needs more. The years took him where you already know: King Oliver, Chicago, the Hot Five, the West End blues that reorganized what music could be. Fame so enormous it wrapped the globe. Ambassador Satch, Pops, the White Handkerchief, the grin the whole world thought it understood. But a strange thing sat underneath all of it, and only a few people close to him ever noticed. Louis Armstrong, the most celebrated entertainer on the planet, kept getting quietly, privately angry about something almost nobody else remembered. He'd read about hatred in the newspapers, about people turned away, kept out, made small for the accident of who they were born to. And a man who had every reason in the world to be bitter about how America had treated a poor black child would instead go still and think about a Jewish family on a coal wagon and the lullaby and the $5. He wore a Star of David on a chain under his shirt for it. Every day, on every stage, through every triumph. In some tellings it was Lucille, his wife, who had it made for him. In others he'd worn one in some form for decades. What is not in question is the reason. He wore it, he said, for the Karnofskys, so he would never, not for one performance, forget the family that fed him and believed in him when the world would not. They were always warm, he wrote, in that shaky old man's hand. I was only 7, but I could easily see the ungodly treatment the whites were handing the poor Jewish family whom I worked for. I learned to admire the Jewish people. They had such wonderful souls. He wrote it in 1970. He had less than a year to live. That's the manuscript almost nobody saw while he was alive. In the last months of his life, weak, his great heart failing, Louis Armstrong sat in the house on 107th Street in Corona and poured out onto hotel stationery not the story of his fame, not the records, not the presidents, not the sold-out halls, but the story of a Lithuanian junk family and a hungry boy and a horn in a pawnshop window in 1907. Of all the things he could have chosen to say at the end, that is what he needed to set down. That is what he wanted the world to remember. He titled it plainly, The Memoir of Louis Armstrong and the Jewish Family in New Orleans in the year 1907. He died on the 6th of July, 1971, in his sleep, in the same modest house where he'd lived out his quiet years. And when they prepared him, there it was, the small silver star, warm from a lifetime against his skin, the last honest witness to a debt he had spent 64 years refusing to forget. He could have taken it off any day he liked. The most famous Baptist in America wearing another people's star. Nobody would have blamed him. Nobody was watching that closely. He wore it in the dark, under the collar, where no audience ever saw. That's the whole thing, right there. He didn't wear it to be seen wearing it. The coronet is long gone.
The wagon, the pawn shop, the muddy battlefield streets, all of it paved over. All of it vanished under a New Orleans that forgot it ever stood there. But somewhere in a collection today sits a few pages of shaky handwriting, and behind glass in a museum sits a small, tarnished star. And together they tell the one thing the man with the golden horn wanted said after he was gone. Somebody believed in him for $5 they didn't have. He spent his whole enormous life making sure the world would never let them be forgotten. And he'd tell you if you asked that the trumpet was never really the beginning. The beginning was a family who fed a stranger's child in the cold and called him a man and bet everything they had on a note that hadn't been played yet. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us keep these old memories alive. Was there ever a stranger who believed in you before you'd earned it? Someone you never got to thank? Tell us about them in the comments.